I would like to introduce our next speaker, Nat Brewster Nguyen, and pronouns are she, her, they, them, and they'll be talking about sex workers on the front lines. You got it, Nat.
All right, I was already talking. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, my name is Natalie Brewster Nguyen, and I am a sex worker and have been for over 20 years. And I just want to talk about the anti-sex trafficking movement and the dangerous rhetoric of it, and the way sex workers have been approaching decriminalization. And I just wanted to reflect that all the speakers have been really amazing, and I'm really feeling a connection to Stephanie's talk about social work, because that these things have some crossovers. So to start, I just want to talk about what the word trafficking really means. That word gets thrown around all the time. Many people equate the word trafficking to like being smuggled, being transported across the border. Yes, I will slow down. And forced into slavery. But that's not at all what the word trafficking in its current legal and conventional use means at all. Trafficking can be used to describe anyone who is coerced into labor of any way. And of course, this is leaned into heavily around sex trafficking. I want to highlight some of the damaging rhetoric and problematic language in the anti-trafficking movement. To begin with, the anti-sex trafficking movement is highly sensationalized and uses falsified numbers and falsified propaganda campaigns to sell their messages. Photos of young girls in cages and trauma porn sell stories. They want you to imagine your daughter, your young white daughter, being kidnapped from your local mall and sold into a life of sex slavery, probably to devious rings of men of color. It doesn't happen like this. But you know what does happen: the sensationalization of the white slave trafficking myth. It's happened 3 notable times in American history, and it arises at times of large cultural shifts or growing trends of, or fear of immigration. It's a political tool used to control the populace, enforce capitalism, increase policing and surveillance, and pass restrictive laws. I'm going to talk briefly about one of those times and then about the current movement. The first one is the lead up to the Mann Act. It was passed in 1910. In its original form, the act made it a felony to engage in interstate or foreign commerce transport of any woman or girl for the purpose of prostitution or debauchery for any other immoral purpose. Obviously, ambiguous language like immoral allows a law to be interpreted in all sorts of ways. But first, let's talk about why the act was passed. According to historian Mark Thomas Connolly, a group of books and pamphlets appeared announcing a startling claim. A pervasive and depraved conspiracy was at large in the land, brutally trapping and seducing American girls into lives of enforced prostitution or white slavery. These white slave narratives, or white slave tracts, began to circulate around 1909. Such narratives often portrayed innocent girls victimized by a huge, secret, and powerful conspiracy controlled by foreigners, as they were drugged or imprisoned and forced into prostitution. This excerpt from The War on the White Slave Trade was written by the United States District Attorney in Chicago. One thing should be made very clear to the girl who comes up to the city, and that is that the ordinary ice cream parlor is very likely to be a spider's web for her entanglement. This is perhaps especially true of those ice cream saloons and fruit stores kept by foreigners. Scores of cases are on record where young girls have taken their first step toward white slavery in places of this character. These stories depended on the heavy use of stereotypes, racism, fear of foreigners, especially at the time Chinese men, due to the increasing immigration of Chinese laborers, and were entirely fictional. They were also due to increasing urbanization, women increasingly taking factory jobs and urban jobs and living alone. But they stirred the public into a frenzy. and led to the criminalization of brothels, the outlawing of prostitution state by state, as well as the passing of the Mann Act. After its passage, the Mann Act was used to enforce social controls on things like interracial and queer relationships and women's autonomy. And that's pretty much what it looks like today. The sensationalized version of the myth of trafficking is inextricably linked to the virginal, naive, young, and white perfect victim. Let's look at how anti-sex trafficking organizations define sex trafficking and just how convoluted it can be. For instance, Project Rose and Project Raise, two prostitution diversion initiatives in Phoenix and Tucson that began around 2009 and got tons of funding, used this list of reasons that people become victims of trafficking. This was published on their flyers and booklets and website. How do individuals become victims of trafficking? Rose Sapowitz, 2010. Running away and living in the streets. 2. Girls, women may be recruited by Romeo pimps who convince them that they love and care about them. 3. Girls, women may be kidnapped and forced by guerrilla pimps, also read Black. 4. Involvement in gang-related prostitution. 5. A parent or related pimps their child. 6. Freely enter and participate in prostitution for fun or excitement. 7. Gay males accessing the gay community via the hustle market. 8. International or domestic major crime operations, circuits. I want to draw your attention to reasons 6 and 7 that people become victims of trafficking. They are freely entering and participating in prostitution for fun and excitement. And 7, gay males accessing the gay community via the hustle market. So you become a victim of coercion by choosing to be a sex worker, though economic necessity is not mentioned, just fun, excitement, and accessing the gay community. All of the other reasons, to me, are actually just domestic violence or just violence. Okay, so other major anti-trafficking groups use similar problematic ways to identify sex trafficking victims and bump up their numbers of victims rescued to justify the amount of funding they receive. They have a very hard time finding enough people that actually check these boxes. And so you're very, very encouraged to say you are a victim of trafficking. And where does this rescue often begin? It begins with arrest. And that's where the social workers come in, right? Like arrest is the entry point to any of these sort of social service programs or diversion programs. Let me tell you that I have never met a sex worker who hoped for that kind of rescue. There's also a heavy rhetoric around the increasing problem of child prostitution or the increasing problem of sex trafficking. What we are actually seeing is increasing policing and arrest and falsely classifying workers as victims. With increased arrest and policing, prostitution doesn't go away. It goes further and further underground. And the further underground it is, the less able we are able to address violence and exploitation. Already stigmatized, sex workers live under constant fear of arrest while trying to survive. They are afraid to access social services or report violence to anyone, especially cops and doctors. I know that I can never tell my medical providers, especially except in the most radical clinics, about my real life. When prostitution is criminalized, outdoor workers, trans workers, and people of color are the ones most likely to get arrested, of course. And in that arrest, often cops have sex or do violence to sex workers before arresting them. Since the 1960s, sex workers have been organizing, asking for social services, protection from violence, and recognition of our basic human rights, such as theft of services, etc. I could highlight the violence and abuses that do happen to sex workers all too regularly. Sex workers can tell you what exploitation really looks like. Religion, domestic violence, parental abuse, misogyny, and transphobia. Sex workers are the most disposable of all people. Think about how many shows and movies. If you want to kill someone, but you don't want anyone to feel too bad about it, or you want to feel like she had it coming, you kill a whore. And yet, we are all victims. Prostitution and or sex trafficking is used conveniently to fit into a political or religious agenda as needed, not for our rights or our dignity. In the Trump era, the use of sex trafficking and trauma/savior porn creates universal enemies and passes bills that no one can say no to. To say no would be political suicide. Some of these laws are like Sesta Fosta, the Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act, which penalizes websites like Backpage for running ads, but essentially takes the freedom of the internet away from all of us. It's used as an excuse for increased surveillance and arrest, increased sweeps and stings, and even the use of the SWAT team. I was personally under surveillance for 2 years as a suspected victim of human trafficking and various things like that. Police were coming to my house, and there are police reports in which my whole physical body, including all of my tattoos and scars, are described in detail. Sex workers have been fighting this fight for a long time. We've been talking about the problems with police. We've been asking for rights, asking for decriminalization across the board. We've been the ones ready to throw down. To actually end sexual exploitation, we need to decriminalize adult consensual prostitution. We should also recognize that most underage or child prostitution is a result of teens leaving home because of domestic violence or an unaccepted LGBTQI+ identity. These teens do sex work to survive. We call it survival sex, and are often experiencing homelessness. If half the resources we pour into policing and prisons were redirected into services, the issue of coercive sex trafficking would be dramatically reduced. Working at a low-paying job for shitty bosses and a negative impact on your body for less than a living wage is coercive. Capitalism is coercive. Economic necessity is the only reason we take on any job. And if we want to tackle exploitation in the sex industry, what we really need to tackle is poverty. And we tackle poverty by dismantling capitalism. In closing, they're not wrong. There is a real crisis of human trafficking, just as there is a real crisis at the border. But in both of these cases, the crisis has been created, sensationalized, popularized, and spread in the media by the government and those in power. In this current system, we are all criminals. How are you a criminal? If they drew a line in the sand, which side of it would you be on? If your character were up for review, would you pass? It's a trick question, only if they wanted you to. The only liberation is abolition and decriminalization. So that's what I have. I'm not sure, are there questions?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Natalie. It looks like we do have a question.
I can tell, I have a couple stories on deck also that I can tell if we don't have questions, but you have a question?
We do have a question. So the question is, do you have any resource recommendations for non-sex workers who want to combat the sensationalized anti-trafficking rhetoric?
Yes, I'm going to send a couple of articles. And the one that I'll just say right now is Reframe Health and Justice is a really good one that some friends of mine are working on out of DC.
Awesome, thank you. That is the only, and I have another question here. We have another one. Are there, let me see. Okay, so someone is wondering, what are your thoughts on the Earn It Act? How might we oppose it effectively?
I think the Earn It Act is one of the acts that's like the Swedish model. Is that right? I'm just gonna look it up really quick because I forget which one that was. I'm thinking of the wrong one. Framework governing the prevention of online sexual exploitation of children. I can't really speak to this without reading more about it. So Facebook and Twitter, best practices. I would have to, yeah, I'd have to do a little more research. I'm not as up on that one in particular. I think what I would say though is you always have to be careful about riders on these bills where they'll use inflammatory language. Like you can't say, you can't oppose a bill that says we're trying to end child pornography, right? You can't say no to that. But often there's a lot more that's in the fine print of those bills. So.
Awesome. And we have another question. Are there resources for current/former sex workers in finding the courage to talk about these things in terms of sharing your story to help create change?
Yeah, there's some great websites. Bound Not Gagged is one. Tits and Sass is another. Tits and Sass is really good, and you can kind of like share your stories anonymously if you want by contacting the authors. Again, Reframe Health and Justice, I would look there. The Sex Worker Project out of New York. And in terms of just, and then SWOP USA, SWOP, the Sex Worker Outreach Project, is a project that I've worked with for a long time. We had a Tucson chapter for quite a while, but we don't anymore, but or not super active one. But there's various things. But another thing that all of this increased policing and things has done is that we were able to have conferences before, right? We would have conferences. We've always had to be very careful about what our organizing looks like because you can be arrested for promotion of prostitution, which can happen just by trying to organize sex workers. So we've had to be incredibly careful, and we're always worried about infiltration, and we're always worried about them just identifying us if we get together in one place. But now, in addition, we have to worry about these SESTA FOSTA laws where we can't even be like advertising our conferences or anything like that. So it's really tricky. In the past, I would have said like, come to this thing, but the one place that we're sort of getting in under the radar to do some organizing, or one of the places is at the Woodhull Sexual Freedom Summit, which is usually in August. But we've started to have a sex worker track there, and current and former are all welcome. And it's a good place to just meet allies and talk about that stuff. But getting on some of the, and there's sex workers all over Twitter. So sex worker Twitter is very high traffic. So that's a good place to just kind of start interacting with folks. And I really hope and I encourage you to tell your story.
Okay, and we have another question. How has sex work been changed during COVID-19? It
is completely decimated the industry, obviously. I mean, we're all out of jobs. And some people are still working, but it's scary. And most of us chose to go online. But it's been a really hard pivot. I haven't gone back to work, and most people I know, if you're in a different state where it's a little bit less crazy, some people are starting to go back to work, but it's just like any other person-to-person close contact work. We're trying to figure it out, but I've been okay, and sex workers who are have worked their way up or are middle class or are more stable and in housing and are with the new gig work stuff, some have been able to get unemployment. But as always, it impacts most directly folks who are, queer, trans, POC, unstable housing, undocumented, don't pay taxes, disenfranchised in other ways. And so we've been kind of protecting each other and trying to do a lot of mutual aid, but sex workers are often the only people that look after other sex workers. So it's really hard to draw attention to that issue.
And I just want to follow up on that question. Is there a way to help, in providing mutual aid as a community member?
There are some great projects. My friend Monica Jones in Phoenix started something called the Outlaw Project. It was named for beautiful Black trans sex worker named Sharmis Outlaw, who died a couple years ago. And so she's taking donations for trans sex workers and POC trans sex workers. So she's headlining that, and then there's a few other projects in various places. Here in Tucson, we have one called Sweet Spot AZ, and that's on Instagram. But it's kind of, we don't have, in terms of like proper mutual aid, it's more that, we're just kind of helping each other get through right now. And a lot of people are trying to sort of pivot and get online, and it's an interesting shift. And I think some good things will come out of it. Like, we're all getting more connected with each other, so that's cool. But yeah.
Thank you. Those are all the questions. Thank you so much for your presentation and for answering the questions.
Do I have a couple more minutes, or are we at time?
I'm not sure. Mo could tell us.
Yeah, if you can go ahead for one more minute, and then I'll introduce the next speaker. So go ahead.
Okay. I am just going to tell a funny story, which is about the sex trafficking thing in terms of policing, which is that there was this place called the Goddess Temple in Phoenix that was like a tantra sex workspace kind of. And they were classified as a church and all this. And I went up there one time and I was shocked at how they were kind of bold with their advertising and stuff. And I was like, how are they not getting arrested? Anyway, it turns out that they were under surveillance and sending stings in and Vice all the time for like a whole year. They had them under investigation. And then finally at the end, they were like, okay, we're going to go bust them. And they took the SWAT team and they went and busted them. And they were like, the Goddess Temple was like all like white women over 40 and 50 and like one man. And they were like writing these sad articles like, there were no minors or drugs or weapons present and da-da-da. And it was just exactly this picture of the kind of wasted resources and incredible permission that these laws give. And I was always thinking, like, how much money did the Phoenix Police Department spend on making that bust to get like nothing out of it? So anyway, that's my story. Thanks, everybody.
Awesome. Thank you, Natalie. Thank you for sharing that.